At my father's funeral, while everyone was quiet, heads bowed, my brother leaned over and whispered something that made my blood run cold. "He left her nothing," he said, loud enough for a few people around us to hear. "She never meant anything to him." I didn't react. I didn't even turn my head. I just stared straight ahead, my hands clenched in my lap. My stomach twisted, but I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing me crack. I had come to say goodbye, to pay my last respects, even if my relationship with my father had been complicated, distant, mostly silent, sometimes painful. But I never expected cruelty from my own brother. Not today. Lance always knew how to twist the knife. He was my father's favorite, the golden son who could do no wrong. He inherited the business, the house, the trust. I inherited nothing but silence. After the service, the lawyer confirmed it. Everything had been left to Lance. Every last dollar. He sat there smug, pretending to mourn, but his eyes sparkled like he had won some prize. I stayed quiet. What was the point in arguing with the dead? But just as the lawyer began packing up his papers, a nurse I'd never seen before stepped forward. She looked nervous but determined, holding a small white envelope. She said, "Are you Amira Thorne?" I nodded. "He asked me to deliver this to you, and only you." And that's when everything changed. I hadn't seen my father in nearly 2 years before the funeral, not since our last conversation ended in silence. No yelling, no final blowout, just the quiet disappointment of two people who had never really understood each other. His name was David Thorne. To most people, he was a respected man, a sharp businessman, co-founder of a financial firm, a donor to 3 local charities, and the face of control and order. But to me, he was something else entirely, an absence. He was the man who raised me without ever really seeing me. My brother, Lance, was different. He was the image of my father in every way, confident, polished, goal-driven. He joined Dad's company right out of college, was promoted within a year, and started wearing suits that cost more than I made in a month. He knew how to speak Dad's language. Numbers, results, legacy. I didn't. I was the daughter who pursued writing, moved away from the city, and never came back for the family holidays. I became the stranger they spoke of in short, sharp phrases. When I was little, my father kept to himself. My mother, Elise, was the warmth in the house. She would sing while she folded laundry, kiss our foreheads even when we didn't want her to, leave little notes in our lunchboxes with smiley faces and short poems. When she died, I was 10. Lance was 13. Her funeral felt like the start of something we couldn't name, but felt every day after. The house got colder. My father became a man of strict routines and brief nods instead of hugs. Lance adapted. I didn't. As the years passed, I tried. I really did. I brought home stories I had written. I got scholarships, graduated early, submitted my first short story to a national contest. I remember handing it to him at dinner one night, excited, waiting for his reaction. He didn't even open it. He pushed it aside, asked me if I had considered a real job. That night, I stopped trying to prove anything to him. Our final conversation was 2 years ago. I'd called to tell him I was moving to Vermont to take a job teaching creative writing. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. I thought maybe this time he'd be proud, but all he said was, "So you're still running from responsibility?" I told him he didn't know who I was. He said, "Maybe I don't want to." And that was it. We never spoke again. So when I stood in the church, surrounded by people in dark suits and stiff expressions, I didn't know how to feel. Grief was there, yes, but it wasn't clean. It was mixed with resentment, guilt, confusion. I had lost something I never really had, and that was a strange kind of ache. Lance stood near the casket like he was hosting the event. He shook hands, gave short, rehearsed smiles, offered polite nods. When I arrived, he looked me over like I was a stranger who had wandered in off the street. "Didn't think you'd come," he said. I did. "That's brave, considering." "Considering what?" I asked. He didn't answer, just walked away like I had already lost some invisible contest I never agreed to play. During the service, I watched people cry. Some spoke about my father's generosity. One man said he mentored him for years and changed his life. Another called him a pillar of the community. I listened, wondering if we had known the same man. The will reading was scheduled right after the service. It was held in a side room at the funeral home. The lawyer, Mr. Carlyle, was professional, old school, with a briefcase that looked older than I was. He greeted us, opened a folder, and began reading. To my brother, everything. To me, nothing. No explanation. No note. No acknowledgement. I expected disappointment, but somehow hearing it out loud still hit harder than I imagined. Like he had taken one last chance to erase me, and this time it would stick. Lance turned to me with that smirk I'd known since childhood, the one that said he had won again and I would never catch up. That's where I sat, number alone, watching him bask in victory. And then a woman I had never seen before, a nurse, stepped forward holding a white envelope in her hand. She said, "Are you Amira Thorne?" I said yes. She looked me straight in the eye. "Your father asked me to give this to you, and only you." The moment the nurse handed me the envelope, the air in the room shifted. Her name tag read Mallory, and her face was lined with kindness and something else, protectiveness, like she was guarding something important. She didn't glance at anyone else, not even Lance, who was standing only a few feet away. Her eyes stayed on me. "Your father was very clear," she said. "This is for you, no one else." Lance stepped forward, irritation breaking through his polite facade. "I'm sorry. Who are you again?" "I'm Nurse Mallory. I cared for your father during the last weeks of his life." Lance forced a polite smile. "Then I assume you're familiar with his will. Everything's been settled." Mallory didn't flinch. "He also left this. He gave it to me directly and said it was only to be opened by his daughter, Amira." Mr. Carlyle, the lawyer, raised an eyebrow. I wasn't informed of any additional documents. Mallory opened her bag and pulled out a sealed white envelope. It was slightly worn at the corners. My name was written on the front in thick black ink, his handwriting. There was no mistaking it. I took it without saying a word. Lance scoffed. "This is ridiculous. Probably some sentimental nonsense. Doesn't change anything." I turned to him, calm on the outside but fighting to keep my voice steady. "Then why do you look nervous?" He didn't answer. I sat down and stared at the envelope. My fingers trembled, but I held it tightly. I wasn't ready to open it. Not yet. There were too many eyes, too many agendas. For a moment, I just needed to breathe. The room was silent, tense, as if the will had been a performance, and now this envelope had interrupted the script. Lance paced. Mr. Carlyle looked uncomfortable. Even some of our distant relatives shifted in their chairs, unsure what to say. Mallory broke the silence. "Your father wasn't a perfect man," she said, her voice low but unwavering. "But in the last few weeks, he tried to make peace with that. He spoke about you often, Amira. Not about your failures, about your strength, about how he wished he'd seen you sooner." I blinked, unsure how to take that in. It didn't fit with the man I had known, the man who missed recitals, forgot birthdays, stayed late at work to avoid dinner conversations, and yet here she was, a stranger, telling me he had been thinking about me in his final days. Lance couldn't take it anymore. "Whatever's in that letter, it has no legal standing. The estate is already transferred." "I don't care about the estate," I said. "This isn't about money." But that wasn't entirely true. It wasn't about the money itself. It was about what it represented. Recognition, inclusion, a sign that I mattered to the man who had always kept me at arm's length. Mr. Carlyle cleared his throat. "Technically, anything outside the will can't impact the division of assets. But if there's evidence of a final wish, especially from a medical witness, it could complicate matters." Lance turned on him. "You're a lawyer. You should know better than to entertain this." "I'm also an officer of the court," Carlyle replied coolly, "and if there's video or signed testimony, it's worth reviewing." Mallory reached into her bag again. "He asked me to record something. He couldn't physically sign a new document, but he wanted his words captured. He said, 'They'll believe it if they hear it from me.'" My heart pounded. I looked at the envelope again, still sealed in my hand. My father had never been a sentimental man, but maybe, near the end, he had changed. Maybe he had finally seen me, not as a burden or disappointment, but as his daughter, as someone worth reaching out to. "I want to open it alone," I said. Lance rolled his eyes. "Of course you do. "I'm not doing this for drama," I said. "I need to know what he was trying to say, and I'm not going to let your bitterness ruin that." He didn't respond, just turned away, jaw clenched. As I walked out of the room with the envelope clutched in my hand, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not victory, not even hope. Clarity. Whatever was inside, it was meant for me, and no one could take that away. I stepped outside with the envelope pressed tightly in my hand. The funeral home's garden was quiet, tucked behind the building where no one followed. For the first time all day, I could breathe. I sat on a wooden bench near the fountain, my fingers tracing the edge of the envelope. It felt heavier than it should have. The paper was soft, worn at the corners like it had been handled more than once. My name was written in my father's distinct handwriting. Sharp, angled, unchanging. For years I had told myself I didn't need anything from him. Not love, not approval, not answers. But I was wrong. I needed this. Not just the envelope. I needed to know that I wasn't invisible to him. I opened it carefully. Inside was a folded letter, a brass key, and a small photograph. The photo was old. I recognized the moment instantly. I was 6 years old, sitting on my mother's lap, covered in paint. She was smiling, holding my hands, both of us stained with blue and green from one of our weekend art sessions. My father had taken that picture. I remembered now. He had leaned into the doorway, snapped it quickly, and disappeared again. The letter began simply. "Amira, if you are reading this, it means I didn't find the courage to say what I needed to while I was alive. I failed in many ways, but my greatest failure was how I treated you." My hands shook. I blinked hard and kept reading. I told myself I was preparing you for the world, that keeping you at a distance would toughen you. I see now that I was just afraid. You reminded me too much of your mother. You were too bright, too passionate, too alive. I didn't know how to handle it, so I pushed you away. Lance fit into my world. You never did. But that was never your fault. That was mine. After the cancer diagnosis, I started writing letters, watching old tapes, reading your stories. I kept every single one, even the ones I told you didn't matter. I kept your first published piece in a drawer in my study. I've read it more times than I can count. I just didn't know how to tell you that I was proud. The key is to the cedar chest in my study closet. Inside are your mother's journals, her paintings, and my own attempts at apology. I wanted to change the will to reflect the truth, but I waited too long, and my health declined faster than I expected. Still, I asked Nurse Mallory to help me record my last wishes. I needed you to have this. Because the legacy I want to leave isn't money or property. It's truth. You were never a disappointment. You were the part of me I wish I had been brave enough to embrace. I'm sorry. I love you. Dad. I read it twice before I could breathe again. The words pressed into my chest like a weight and a release all at once. I had spent years building armor to protect myself from a father who never seemed to care. And now, here it was, unraveling in my hands. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't enough to erase the years of silence. But it was real. It was something. The brass key sat in my palm, warm from my grip. I knew exactly where it went. The cedar chest in his study had been locked for as long as I could remember. I had once asked about it when I was 13. He had told me it was just old files. I never asked again. I stood up and looked back at the funeral home, where Lance was likely still arguing with Mr. Carlyle, trying to maintain control. He had always been obsessed with control, with being the one who won. But this wasn't a game anymore. This was something he couldn't touch. I walked to my car, heart racing, not from fear, but from a strange, powerful pull. I wasn't sure what I would find inside that chest, but I knew it was meant for me. Whatever my father had hidden there, it would not be numbers or contracts. It would be pieces of him, pieces of her, pieces of me. This wasn't about reclaiming an inheritance. It was about reclaiming a history I had been shut out of, a voice I had long believed didn't exist. And now I was finally ready to hear it. I drove straight to the house, not to the cemetery, not to the reception. I had nothing left to say to Lance or anyone else circling like vultures around my father's estate. The Thorne house sat quiet at the top of its long driveway. It looked exactly the same as when I left it 10 years ago. Gray stone, white shutters, sharp corners that made it look more like a courthouse than a home. The porch creaked under my shoes as I unlocked the front door. Inside, the air was still. The furniture was untouched, staged for showings or inheritance photos, but I knew the way. My steps found the path to the study without thinking. His study had always been off limits. When we were kids, we weren't even allowed to peek inside. Even after I was grown, the door remained mostly shut. It had always felt like a vault built around his private life, his real one, the version he never shared. I stepped inside. The room smelled faintly of cedar and paper. His desk was neatly arranged. No dust, no disorder. Everything had its place. The walls were lined with books, degrees, a framed newspaper article from when he was named one of the top CEOs in the state. And there it was, the cedar chest. It sat beneath the window exactly where I remembered. Unmoving, untouched, locked. Until now. I knelt beside it and slid the brass key into the lock. It turned with a quiet click. The lid lifted easily. Inside were stacks of folders, canvas rolls, photo albums, and 3 leather-bound journals tied with faded red ribbon. The scent of old paper and dried paint filled the air. I reached for the journals first. My mother's name was written on the inside cover of each one, Elise Thorne. The handwriting was hers, fluid, bright, full of life. As I flipped through the pages, I saw poems she had written during her final year, drawings of me and Lance, letters she never sent. She wrote about her hopes for us, her fear of dying too young, and her longing for my father to show more warmth. She had left pieces of herself for us, and they had been hidden for more than 20 years. I was still holding her 3rd journal when I noticed the folder beneath it. It was labeled in my father's handwriting, for Amira. Inside were copies of every story I had ever sent him. The short story that won 2nd place in my college contest, the poem I had published in an online magazine, even the essay I had submitted for graduate school. He had printed them out, annotated them with notes in the margins, things like strong opening, vivid imagery, and one that simply said, "This one made me cry." I covered my mouth and sat back against the wall. This man, who I had believed never saw me, had read everything. And he hadn't just read it. He understood it. He had known me more than I realized, maybe more than I had allowed him to. I found a flash drive at the bottom of the chest, labeled Final Message. I plugged it into the laptop he had left behind. His face appeared on the screen, thinner than I remembered, eyes tired but focused. "Amira," he began, "I'm sorry I didn't say this sooner. If you're watching this, it means I didn't make it. But I needed to speak directly to you, because a letter didn't feel like enough." He paused for a breath. Then he said, "You were never a mistake. I was the one who failed to see you for who you were. I was so afraid of losing control that I pushed you away instead of pulling you in. Everything I hid in that chest was meant for you, not just the contents, the truth. The parts of your mother I buried, the parts of myself I was too ashamed to share. I don't care if the will says otherwise. That house is yours. That room is yours. Your mother wanted it that way, and now so do I." The video ended without fanfare, just silence and a still frame of a man who finally, in his last days, had faced what mattered. I sat there for a long time, not crying, not angry, just still. The kind of stillness that comes after a storm has finally passed. He didn't leave me out. He just didn't know how to include me until it was too late, but he tried. And that effort, even delayed, meant more than I expected it could. For the first time in years, I felt something settle inside me. Not closure. That's a myth. But something close. Something real. I stayed in the house that night. I didn't plan to. I had packed nothing, expected nothing. But after everything I had just seen, the idea of leaving felt wrong. I made a bed on the couch in the living room and let the weight of the day settle into my chest. It wasn't grief, exactly, or at least not the kind I had expected. It was more like something heavy unraveling inside me. In the morning, I walked back into the study and opened my mother's journals again. I read until the sun rose. Her voice came through every page with warmth and wit and fierce love. She had wanted us to grow up brave. She had worried about how we'd manage without her. She had asked my father, in one of her entries, to make sure Amira knows she matters. Maybe it had taken him too long. Maybe the damage had already been done. But he tried. In his own flawed way, he tried to honor that promise. 2 weeks later, I met with Mr. Carlyle again. I brought the letter, the flash drive, and Mallory's statement. He listened carefully, then nodded. "There's enough here to challenge the existing will," he said, "especially with the video. And since the house hasn't officially transferred to your brother, we can file a claim." Lance wasn't happy. He sent a short message through his attorney, accusing me of exploiting sentiment and undermining our father's wishes. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The truth had already spoken for itself. The legal process took time, but in the end, I kept the house. I didn't want the money. I let Lance have it. Let him keep the company, the accounts, the control. He could stay in his world of profit margins and prestige. I had something better, something he never noticed was missing. The legacy my father left me wasn't measured in dollar signs. It was measured in understanding, in regret, in effort, and in that small, simple word he had never said before, love. I turned the study into a writing room, not just for me, but for others. I opened it twice a week as a creative space for young writers who had no place to go. We read my mother's stories. We painted. We laughed. We wrote things that felt too honest and too raw for classrooms or workshops. It became something real, something alive. One day, I found a folder hidden in the bottom of the chest I had somehow missed. It was filled with letters my father had written but never sent. Some were addressed to me. Others were notes to himself. They weren't polished or even coherent in places, but they were honest. And they showed a man who had spent the last months of his life trying to understand who he had been and who he had hurt. That was the thing I never expected. Not just the apology, but the effort behind it. He could have died with the same silence he lived in. But he didn't. He asked a nurse to deliver something no lawyer could. He chose words over wealth, meaning over inheritance. That choice rewrote the end of our story. Months later, I published a book, a hybrid memoir, half my writing, half my mother's journals and artwork. At the center was my father's letter. I titled it The Chest Under the Window, A Daughter's Inheritance. It didn't hit bestseller lists, it didn't make headlines, but it found readers. One day at a book event, a teenage girl walked up to me, clutching her copy like it was something fragile. She asked, "Did your dad ever read your stories while you were still writing them?" I paused for a moment before answering. Then I said, "He did. Just not when I needed him to." She nodded like she understood something I hadn't expected her to. That was the truth of it. Some people find their way back too late to change the past, but not too late to leave something meaningful behind. My father didn't raise me with words, but in the end, he left me his. And in choosing to open that envelope, I finally opened the part of my life I thought had been sealed forever. And maybe that's what matters most. Not how a story starts, or even how it falls apart, but how we choose to carry the truth forward once we finally have it in our hands. If this story spoke to you, if it reminded you of someone you've loved or lost, please take a second to like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and leave a comment below. I read everyone, and your stories matter too. And if you want more real stories that stay with you long after they end, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one. Thank you for being here.